And welcome to the ACTA Health Economics Alongside Trials HEAT Special Interest Group. This is our webinar series. My name's Rachel Morton. I'm a co-convener of this group, and I'm Professor of Health Economics and Deputy Director at the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm calling in from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present and any First Nations people who are with us today. Our webinar series involves methodological experts from a range of different topics of relevance to cost effectiveness analysis and health economic evaluation alongside trials and using trial data in economic models. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce our presenter today. She's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Our speaker is Dr. Rebecca Mercier-Beber, and Rebecca's an NHMRC Early Career Fellow, and she's specialises in quality of life research. She's the quality of life lead at the centre at the University of Sydney. Rebecca's research focuses on the methodology of patient-reported outcomes, PROs, in clinical trials, and she leads the PRO endpoints of several oncology, COVID-19 and nephrology, Australian and international clinical trials. Rebecca is also an executive member of the ISAQOL Best Practices for PROs Task Force, which led the development of the Spirit Pro or Spirit PRO guidelines for patient-reported outcome content of trial protocols. So we've got a very experienced speaker today, and I'd like you all to welcome her. If you can stay on mute, or please mute your microphones, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, for that introduction. We'll just wait for ACTA to share the slides. We were having a bit of technical difficulties with me sharing, so ACTA will be sharing them for me. Okay, great. Can everybody see those? Okay.
Yes.
Just let me organise my own screen. Okay. So thanks everyone for joining today. So this presentation will give a quick overview of various guidance documents and resources that have become available in recent years to improve our methodology for PRO endpoints. Okay, next slide. So I thought this was a perfect quote to include in this presentation by Professor Claire Snyder from Johns Hopkins University, who many of you would know. She's a very well-respected PRO research methodologist. And the quote says, the assessment of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials has enormous potential to promote patient-centered care. But for this potential to be realised, the patient-reported outcomes must be captured effectively and communicated clearly. So hopefully by the end of this presentation today, you'll be aware of some of the freely available resources and tools out there to help us capture data effectively and communicate it clearly. Next slide. Okay, so patient-reported outcomes are any report of the patient's health condition that come directly from the patient without interpretation by anyone else. And these can include disease symptoms, side effects of treatment, functional aspects of health, health utility, and quality of life. Next slide. Some related terms, but distinct terms include patient-reported experiences, such as satisfaction with care, unmet needs, inconvenience of treatment, proxy-reported outcomes, where somebody is reporting on behalf of the patient as though they are the patient, patient-reported behaviours, such as the number of cigarettes smoked per day or medication adherence, and aptitude tests like the 6-minute walk test or any sort of cognition test. Next slide. So PROs are being incorporated into trials more commonly now. In 2017, a group of us conducted a review of all of the trials registered on the ANZ CTR at the time, and we determined that 45% of registered trials included at least one PRO, and the proportion of trials with PROs was increasing over time. A few years before this, a similar review was conducted of clinicaltrials.gov, and they found that about 27% of trials registered at the time had PROs. And again, they saw that the rate of inclusion was increasing. Next slide. So in clinical practice, patients want to know how their disease and treatment will impact their health and their daily life. And PRO trial data can help us to answer those questions because we're hearing directly from the patient about the impact of disease and treatment. Next slide. PROs give us the patient's perspective on the impact of disease and treatment directly from the patient. They offer us insight into the unobservable domains of health. Things like nausea, pain, fatigue can't really be assessed in any other way other than directly asking the patient. They improve doctor-to-patient communication and shared decision-making. They help us to interpret other trial endpoints. So if there's no difference on a primary trial endpoint of survival, for example, we can look to our other trial endpoints, including PROs, to determine which one might be more favorable to patients. And in many conditions, PROs have prognostic significance. And these were some systematic reviews I found in oncology and heart failure that showed the various different PROs that were related to survival. Next slide. But to measure PROs well, we need to be assessing the PROs that matter most and at the times that matter. And we need to be using valid, reliable, acceptable tools to measure those PROs. And because we're asking patients about how they feel, PROs are subjective endpoints, and that's the whole point. So we need to use standardized processes to assess those outcomes to ensure that any differences we see reflect true differences and not differences due to the ways that the question has been asked of the patient. And so we typically use questionnaires with standardized questions, standardized response options, standard administration instructions, scoring instructions, interpretation guidelines, and so forth in a research setting. We need to be aware that the people who complete PROs in our clinical trial may not always reflect the characteristics of the people in the trial sample as a whole or in the clinical trial population, or in the clinical population in general, because we need to acknowledge that PROs require certain skills, a time commitment, a level of health and reading literacy, and various other participant-related elements for successful completion. So for whatever reason, some people may not be able to complete PROs. And when we're interpreting our PRO data at the end of the trial, we need to be conscious of what those reasons were. But we also need to consider these factors when we're designing our protocols and when we're planning our trials and engaging consumers in the development of our trials, because we can make decisions ahead of time to help us be more inclusive of our trial population. Next slide. So who may have limited access or capacity to complete PROs? These are just some of the concerns that I could think of at the top of my head that may impact a patient's ability to complete PROs as part of their trial participation. And that's assuming that patients are eligible and willing to participate in a trial in the first place, because we know that a trial population is typically a highly selected representation of the clinical population. So in my experience, talking with consumers can bring some of these concerns to light, because sometimes we as researchers and clinicians don't appreciate all of the barriers to PRO completion. So it's really helpful to brainstorm how to overcome some of these barriers with consumers at the beginning when you're designing your trial. Next slide. So why do we need to overcome these barriers? Because certain sociodemographic subgroups are repeatedly underrepresented in research, and many of those subgroups have or are at higher risk of having worse health outcomes. So if the people with worse outcomes are not represented in our samples, we can overestimate quality of life and we can overestimate functioning in the trial, and then we can't reliably generalize our findings to the clinical population. And on top of that, that means that those subgroups are repeatedly underserved by research, and that can further increase the disparities that they experience and health inequalities that those subgroups experience. Next slide. So when we're designing, I think we all know that the trial protocol is a very important document in a clinical trial. We use it to standardize our trial methodology, but also to explain the rationale behind the research, the research question, the design, the intervention, the analysis, and so forth. So when we're writing our trial protocols, we need to consider all of these factors. And thankfully, there are a number of resources available to help us write trial protocols, which I'll get to in a moment. Next slide. So over the last 15 years or so, myself and others have done a bit of work reviewing trial protocols to determine the sort of content that's included regarding PROs. And in our earlier work across 3 separate studies, we reviewed over 350 trial protocols that had PROs as either a primary or a secondary trial endpoint. And we cross-checked the content against checklists that we'd compiled and developed to determine what sort of content was included. And we found that on average, protocols were only addressing about a third of the recommended PRO-specific items. Next slide. Now, to give you an idea, this was just one of the 3 studies we did. I know the writing is very small. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but I just wanted to show you sort of an overview of what was covered. So this was a focus on ovarian cancer trials, and we identified these trials by their publication. So they were actually older trial protocols. The darker orange bars indicate protocol items that were addressed completely, and the lighter orange bars are items that were addressed partially. So in terms of what was done well and what was usually missing, about 96% of the included trials included PROs in the assessment schedule. So in other words, 4% of trials didn't state when PROs were supposed to be assessed. But only 6 of those studies justified the timing of PRO assessments. PROs were identified as a primary or a secondary endpoint in 92% of trials, but only 31% of those trials had a specific PRO objective. 46% of trials provided data collection instructions, and only 15% included plans for monitoring compliance, and 62% included an analysis plan in the protocol. So it was a bit of a mixed bag in terms of what was there and what wasn't, but overall, these protocols didn't do too badly. Next slide. And it's interesting to see how the results of the ovarian cancer trial cohort compared to a more recent cohort of trial protocols. So these were 2 studies. The EPIC study included oncology trial protocols only. The HTA cohort was a mixed disease trial cohort. And what we did for these 2 studies was we assessed the overall protocol against the SPIRIT checklist, so the recommended items for protocols in general. And then we looked at the PRO-specific content as well. And we found that on average, the trials were addressing between 62 and 63% of recommended SPIRIT items. But when it came to PROs, there was quite a difference. They were on average only addressing about 30 to 33% of recommended items. So PROs, in other words, were being covered not as well as other trial endpoints in trial protocols. And this led us to recommend the development of guidance for PRO content specifically. Next slide. So after an extensive collaborative process involving various stakeholders, journal editors, statisticians, clinician researchers, PRO methodologists, patient partners, industry, people who sat on ethics committees and so forth, we developed the SPIRIT Pro guidance. I won't go into it in detail in the interests of time, but just as an overview, the SPIRIT Pro guidance is designed to be used in conjunction with the SPIRIT guidance for trials. So any trial, and it's to be used for any trial that has a primary or a secondary PRO endpoint. It includes 16 items in total, 11 of which are extensions of the existing Spirit items for PROs, and then there were 5 new PRO-specific items. So the full checklist is available either via the publication on in the JAMA journal or on the Equator website. Next slide. So a few years after publishing the Spirit Pro statement, we published an extension document which gave a little bit more detail about the recommended items, as well as provided some real-life examples. Next slide. So this is just a quick sort of snapshot of how it looks. For each Spirit Pro item, the extension document includes the actual recommended item, an example or two from real life trials, and then an explanation of specifically how you can address that item and why those components are important. Next slide. So as I've mentioned, I'm not going to go into the Spirit checklist in detail, but just as a high level, what you should be including in your protocol. In terms of the rationale for your study, you need to be considering your target patient population specifically. You need to think about what domains matter to your patient population and your research question. What are the time points that matter? What is the time frame that matters to your trial? What do you want to learn? Do you want to establish non-inferiority of the intervention compared to standard of care with regards to patient-reported fatigue or patient-reported physical functioning? Do you want to demonstrate an improvement as a result of the intervention? Do you want to show a difference in time to deterioration in a patient-reported domain, for example? You need to state if your design is exploratory, descriptive, comparative, if you're looking to compare change in groups, or if you're looking at comparing change in a point in time. And based on that, you need to develop a clear PRO rationale, objective, hypothesis, and so forth. Next slide. So your objective, this is just a very rough example of what an objective might look like. You might be looking to compare mean change in fatigue score from Group A versus Group B from baseline to 3 months after completing the intervention. Next slide. Once you've settled on the domains that matter and the time points that matter, you need to select a measure. And a few years ago, I think this was from 2013, ISAQOL released some recommendations about the minimum standards for selecting a measure. So this was led by Bryce Reeve, and I think it's published in Quality of Life Research if you'd like to take a look at the full article. Next slide. So just as a summary, there are theoretical, psychometric, and logistic considerations when selecting a measure. You want to ensure that the measure assesses the domain of interest to your research question and produces a score for those domains. You need to consider whether the recall period of the questionnaire makes sense. For example, do you want to know the patient's pain level right now, or do you want to know their average pain over the past week or over the past month? You want to consider if the response scale makes sense. So are you looking at the frequency of the symptom, of the occurrence of that symptom, or are you looking at how severe the symptom is? You've just got to make sure that the response scale matches what your research objectives are. Very importantly, you must consider how burdensome the questionnaire is in terms of its length, the complexity of the language, if there's any repetition in the questionnaire. You should look at whether consumers were actually involved in the development of the questionnaire, and whether there was a theoretical model to guide the development of the measure. You'd want to check if the psychometric properties have been checked and whether they're acceptable, and whether the measure's actually been used in your clinical population. It's also helpful to check for any guidance to interpret the scores. So in terms of like clinical cut points or thresholds for meaningful change, And that's really important, particularly if the PRO is a primary endpoint in your trial, because you'll need to use that information when calculating your sample size. And also, very importantly, you need to consider whether there are any validated language translations available, because we want to be using validated questionnaire translations rather than human interpreters for our PROs, because then we have more control over the measure being administered in a standardized way. Next slide. So just as a bit of context, more than half of the people currently living in Australia at the moment were born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas. So we really need to be considering language translations in our studies, because otherwise we are potentially overlooking about half of our population. The most common languages other than English in Australia-wide include Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, and Cantonese, and Punjabi and Nepali are fast-growing languages. And it's worth noting that just because these language groups are most common Australia-wide, they may not be the most common language groups in your recruiting centres. So it's important to check that when you're planning your study. And we also have over 167 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages in our population. Next slide. So when we're looking at, when we're choosing a questionnaire, we need to look at the questionnaire itself to make a decision about whether it's suitable for our trial context. So this, as an example, is the FACET fatigue scale. I'm just using fatigue as a running example through this presentation. So it includes 13 questions or 13 items, and it can be used in any health condition where fatigue is a problem. So in terms of the measure itself, we want to check if it's got content validity. Is it measuring what we think it's measuring? To do that, we just look at the questions and we make a decision about whether it's suitable or not for our research question. In terms of burden, we can see that it's not overly long. It uses nice, simple language. So the reading level is reasonably low, which we want. And each question's only asking about one thing. There are no double-barreled questions, which is really important to look for as well, because that can cause confusion for participants. Another thing, the response scale is quite simple and uniform. It doesn't switch plenty of times throughout the questionnaire, so that creates a nice rhythm for the participants when they're completing it. It's easy to respond to. And the recall period is the past 7 days. So again, it's not too long or hard to recall symptoms from those in the past week. Next slide. These are the scoring instructions for the FACET fatigue questionnaire. As we can see, it shows you exactly how to calculate a score, which is really important. Sometimes we might find a measure that's been developed for use in one study only, and it might not have scoring instructions. And I see that happen a lot. Then it's quite a challenge to use the measure again reliably in another trial. This questionnaire also tells us how to interpret the score. So higher scores indicate better quality of life. And we also get one single score for the questionnaire, a total score for the questionnaire representing fatigue. Next slide. So regarding the administration of PRO measures, we might have an idea of how things should be, how the measure might be administered ideally, but in real life, as we've discussed already, we need to exercise some flexibility in our methods to ensure that we're as inclusive as possible of any participants who might be unable to complete PROs for whatever reason in the standard way. So maybe they require a language translation, maybe they require somebody to read the questions for them, maybe we need to consider the acceptable time windows for PRO assessment. We might need to offer more than one mode of administration. So, for example, we might offer electronically administered patient-reported outcomes for those based in rural and remote areas, but we might offer paper completion for those who don't have access to a device. So by being flexible with our methods within reason, and by stating what degree of flexibility is permitted up front, we sort of strike that balance between accommodating the needs of our sick patient population who are being assessed in a busy clinic situation, as well as the need to standardize our methodology so that we have reliable data for our analysis. Next slide. So I've talked a little bit about deciding on what time points are important. What I normally like to do is to sort of map out how we, the investigators, think PROs will look over time and make sure that we're capturing the time points that matter when we're deciding on our time points. But in addition to selecting the target time point, we need to think about what acceptable time windows or what time before and after each target assessment time point will be an acceptable assessment time. So as a general rule, if you're trying to capture the acute effects of an intervention, you'll probably need a narrower acceptable time window for completion. But if you're looking at longer term outcomes from an intervention, or if you're looking at a chronic health condition, for example, perhaps a broader time window would be more acceptable. And in terms of how long to follow up, you need to consider, obviously, how long your trial is funded for. You need to consider what the median survival is if this is an end-of-life population. Also, you need to think about the logistics of contacting people. If you're going to be contacting them years after the intervention, it becomes more difficult to follow up with patients. So those are all things to consider. Next slide. PRO administration instructions. So these are the instructions given to the people who administer the questionnaires, usually nurses or clinical trial investigators at sites. Next slide. So I've found that different research groups address this differently. Some put their instructions into the trial protocol. Others put it in a site manual or in training initiation slides. Having something written for staff to refer to as needed is really your best option, because if they're not seeing patients regularly, they might need a refresher. So providing clear instructions for site staff and participants is really important to encourage honest and reliable responses, to promote patient engagement, to minimize any risk of bias, and to reduce the risk of missing data, and to overall have a high quality PRO study. During my PhD, I interviewed research nurses about the training they'd received. And unfortunately, I found that a lot of them hadn't received any PRO-specific training at all. And they'd often refer to previous studies and the instruction they'd received in previous studies to guide how they would collect PROs in subsequent studies. And a lot of the time that meant that there were vast differences within each trial in terms of how questionnaires were being administered. So it's really important to think about these issues ahead of time and put some guidance in place for your sites so that you can be sure that things are being done in a standardized way across sites. Next slide. In terms of what to cover in your administration instructions, I like to sort of think about what instructions are needed for the site coordinator or your research nurses and what's required for communication to the participant. In terms of what's required for the site coordinator, you'd want to go through what the PRO measures are, what the time points are, and the acceptable windows for completion of those measures. The level of help that they're allowed to provide to participants, remembering that the patient should be reporting their answers and not somebody else. You want to think about why PROs are important in this specific context, because you're providing a voice for the patient with that health condition and receiving that intervention. You want to go through the mode of administration. So are the questionnaires being administered in paper form? Are they being administered using an electronic platform? If so, how do they use the electronic platform? Where do they go to for help? Any specific instructions there? And you also want to go through how to access the validated language translations that you're offering for that questionnaire. For the participants' instructions, you want to talk about why PROs are important. So why are we asking them to do these questionnaires? The importance of them completing the questionnaires themselves, who will see the data, and whether the data will be used to inform their treatment or any supportive care. And that's a really important point because there is some evidence out there that patients will augment their responses if they think that their PRO responses will impact their treatment. So for example, if somebody's receiving chemotherapy, they might underplay their chemo-related toxicity if they think that it means they'll stay on chemo longer. So we need to be clear about the separation between the treatment that they're receiving and the trial outcomes, the data collection, sorry, for PROs. Next slide. So in terms of the development of administration instructions, I think it's really helpful to speak to your research nurses and people who work at the coalface, your site staff, as well as patient partners, and to get input on what they think might be useful to know, to get input on how we can make it easier through the methodology, what would need to be discussed with the patient at each assessment versus what they would only need to be told once, for example, when they're consenting to the trial or when they're at registration. And also think about the specific challenges for your population. So again, what translations would be needed, the fact that family members shouldn't be completing the questionnaires for the patient, what cognitive challenges is this population likely to face, and is there any way that you can accommodate those? What are you going to do in the event of hospitalizations? What are you going to do in the event of a protocol deviation? So if someone's taken off treatment early, for example, and again, any guidance related to the mode of administration. Next slide. Now skipping ahead to the analysis plan. Next slide. So the analysis plan should be developed in collaboration with a statistician always. You want to ensure that your analysis plan aligns with your objectives. So that might sound really obvious, but again, it's something that doesn't always happen in practice. You want to specify who will be included in the analysis. Are there any minimum data requirements, for example? So if you're looking at, if your objective is to look at change, then obviously you'd need 2 assessment time points for each participant to assess change. Having said that, you also need to have a plan in place for how you will address missing data, because the reality is that in a PRO study, we almost always have missing data from participants. And I'm referring to when a patient doesn't complete an assessment at all, as opposed to a few missing questions in a questionnaire, which can usually be accommodated. So obviously missing data causes a really big problem for analysis if the percentage of missing data is high. So you need to have a plan in place for how that will be addressed and how the impact will be explored. You need to have a plan in place for how protocol deviations will be handled. So if you're doing an intention to treat analysis, then, you know, if somebody didn't receive the intervention they were randomized to, you'll need to specify that. And you also need to have a plan in place for how data will be interpreted. So if you're using any clinical cut points, for example, you might want to include that in your analysis plan. Next slide. In terms of guidance available to help prepare an analysis plan, the SciSupport IMI Consortium is developing guidance for the analysis of PROs in oncology trials, but their principles will apply more broadly than oncology, obviously. So this is a work in progress at the moment. They're addressing various unique challenges that statisticians experience when analysing PRO data. This is going to be a really valuable contribution to our field. So keep an eye out for their work. There are a few publications already, but you can also just Google SciSupport and you'll find their website, which explains the various working groups and topics that they're covering. Next slide. So now on to PRO reporting. Next slide. In 2013, some guidance was released about how best to report PROs transparently and completely in the form of the Consort PRO extension. So again, similar to Spirit Pro, the Consort guidance is designed to be used in conjunction with the Consort 2010 statement. It adapts 9 items from the Consort statement for PROs and adds 5 new PRO-specific items for reporting. Myself and others in the ISAQOL Best Practices for PROs Task Force have evaluated the impact of the Consort Pro statement, and we have seen that it is actually helping people to report their PRO endpoints more completely and transparently. We have identified some issues with knowledge translation. We've written a paper about that. The issues were around people using the 5 new PRO-specific criteria only instead of the full Consort Pro checklist. And people have been doing that for when writing their papers, but also when evaluating the completion, the adherence of published reports to the Consort PRO statement. So with respect to evaluating reported PRO studies, we as a task force have published a checklist that can be used for future reviews. But we do want to flag that the original Consort Pro checklist wasn't developed for that purpose. It was developed to help people write their PRO endpoint publications up. And I also want to flag, I haven't got a screenshot of it, but I also want to flag that earlier in 2013, ISAQOL led a publication for recommended PRO, how to report a PRO endpoint, basically. The lead author is Mike Brundage. I think it was published in Quality of Life Research. I highly recommend that paper as well because it's very comprehensive and it was actually the basis of this Consort PRO extension paper. Next slide. Coming to the end now. So I just want to plug the Proteus resources. Proteus stands for Patient-Reported Outcomes, Tools, Engaging Users and Stakeholders. So this wonderful initiative has collated PRO resources all in one place. They've got resources for use in trials as well as for use in clinical practice. And their website just provides links to all of the resources that I've mentioned today and some more. So it's a really useful resource. Next slide. Sorry, that's the Proteus roadmap there. So yeah, highly encourage you to give them a Google and look at their website for all of their resources. Next slide. Okay, and to finish up, in summary, when you're planning your PRO studies, I highly encourage you to identify and address any equity and accessibility concerns for PROs and for the rest of the trial. Engage your consumers with intention. Think about those equity and access issues and really work with your consumers to plan how you might accommodate those issues. And finally, consider the full life of the trial when you're writing your protocol and planning the trial, because if you get your protocol right, you're setting yourself up for success. And yeah, as I've shown, there's guidance available for the full life of the trial. Thank you. Next slide. That's all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was a terrific overview of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials. I think a lot of the audience are health economists and are really responsible for making something of the PRO data that's collected in trials, particularly the generic measures that are utility-based quality of life measures, but also perhaps increasingly some of the symptom scores as well. I'd like to invite everybody now, if they have a question, if they could please put it into the chat So this webinar doesn't have a Q&A button, but it does have the chat window. So if you'd like to put in, they can be comments or questions, and I'll help to draw Rebecca's attention to those. And you can also, if you'd like to ask Rebecca, turn on your camera, come off mute, and just sort of flag yourself that you'd like to ask Rebecca a question. So I'll just make a start. One of the Rebecca, we're always faced with missing data, and missing data. I saw how missing data is handled as one of the items on the checklist that had maybe about a third of trials that you evaluated in that review were clear about how they handled missing PRO data. And training, you've said, of sites is likely to reduce missing PRO data. Do you think there's a role for the health economist on the trial team in training sites about, for instance, EQ5D completion and the importance of complete data for calculating cost effectiveness when we're looking at, or a cost utility analysis where we're looking at quality adjusted survival? Do you think a health economist has a role in training sites, or is it a role for other people within a study team?
That's a good question. I think it's really important for whoever's leading any component of the trial to have input into the training of the site staff for a number of reasons. First, we found in our research that one of the biggest predictors for a good completion rate of any patient-reported outcome data was whether site staff understood the purpose behind collecting the PRO. So I think if the health economist can explain how to complete the health utility questionnaire to the site staff, why that data is being collected, how it will be used in the long term, and put it into context of, how that data will ultimately benefit patients in the future, I think that is a really powerful way that investigators can, improve completion rates.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Ilka, you're on camera. Did you have a question for Rebecca?
Yes, thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you, Rebecca. A great presentation. My question it also relates to missing data. And I was a little bit worried that Rachel was going to ask what I was going to ask. But I think I'll be building on your question, Rachel. Rebecca, you mentioned that despite best efforts, probably there would be some missing information because it is participant-reported outcomes. Could you comment on the value of finding out why questionnaires might not be done?
Yeah, definitely. Well, there are a number of components to that, I guess. If there's only a minor percentage of participants who haven't completed PROs, which does happen, sometimes trials have excellent completion rates, the missing data is not going to make too much of an impact. So it might be less important in those situations. But where you have a high rate of missing data, obviously your PRO sample is not going to be overly representative of the full trial sample. And so you want to understand how your PRO sample essentially is different from the full trial sample and how they're different from the clinical population at large. So if we know, for example, if a patient didn't complete their questionnaire because they were feeling too unwell, we can guess that their unknown PRO response would have been worse, like it would have been a sort of a bad outcome. But if it's just due to some kind of administrative error, we can sort of assume that could have randomly happened to anybody in our trial sample. So the missing outcome is less likely to be related to their PRO endpoint. So one of the things we consider when we're analysing our PRO data is, was the missing response likely to be related to their health outcome? And if so, how are we going to handle that problem? So there are various statistical methods that can be used, but importantly, I think that needs to be reflected in how we report our endpoints, because obviously that's a limitation if we have any missing data, and we need to be transparent about the potential impact of that. So I guess it's it should be communicated in the publication, but it also affects how we analyze the data or handle any missing data before we come to analyzing the data. And yeah, the essential question is, was the missing data likely to be due to having the patient having a poorer PRO outcome, or was it just sort of a random loss of data there?
Yeah, and
Thank
I'll
you.
just add to that from an experience this week, actually, where we're deciding whether we can use multiple imputation to handle missing EQ5D data. And it would be convenient if we could say MAR, missing at random. However, we've had to look at the patterns of missingness, and the first thing we found was that this was a multi-country trial. A couple of countries were told it was optional to collect the EQ5D or not. So already we have countries that are not, joining in. So, it's not missing at random for that. Then we also found we had different completion rates by some patient characteristics. And in this case, it wasn't that they were sick, but that we didn't have translated EQ5D questionnaires, and that we found it wasn't completed by people of certain, ethnic groups or who had languages other than English. So again, we could not justify missing at random. And because of that, we then weren't able to use multiple imputation methods. What we then had to do in our analysis is really revert to a complete case analysis. And in this particular trial, that hugely reduced the sample from which we could use within the trial for calculation of quality adjusted survival. So having the reason documented, I think, is really important, but also we need to look for some characteristics around those. They might be, site characteristics or patient characteristics that also inform the reasons for missingness.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. And that definitely happens. I've seen trials where, the Australian completion rates are reasonably good. And then you look at the international rates, and some countries might have poorer completion. And yeah, I mean, education of the site staff is crucial. Sometimes it's the language issue, just not offering questionnaires in all the languages that are required. So yeah, it just highlights why it's so important to think about the potential issues that you might encounter ahead of time, and just do your best to plan ahead.
Okay, while I'm waiting for other questions from our 31 participants, so please don't be shy, put them into the chat. Rebecca, I've got another question for you about focusing on utility data in economic models, where we use the data collected within the trial, and then we might extrapolate that data over the longer term. So we might have a lifetime, time horizon. The trial could go for, say, 3 years, and then we might be extrapolating that data. And often we would look at other sources of PROs that might have been collected in a clinical quality registry, or from other studies, cohorts that might represent the health states or the health situation of people beyond the trial period. So I'm just wondering if you have any experience in augmenting PROs that are collected within a trial and PROs that are collected outside of a trial, but for the same population, and any particular considerations or documentation that you think we might need to adhere to.
Yeah, I haven't had any personal experience doing that. I suppose it simplifies things from my point of view. I've been lucky that, we've just used what's been collected in a trial context. So that's a tricky one. I guess you'd want to be making sure that, you know, if the measures are different, but the outcomes are the same, how are you going to accommodate for any differences there? So, you know, 2 questionnaires assessing pain may not be assessing the same, you know.
Oh yeah, I'm
aspects
thinking
of
about the
pain.
EQ5D, for instance. So you might have EQ5D collected within the trial, and then EQ5D that comes from the prostate cancer registry, for
Yeah.
instance, or the bone and joint registry.
Yeah. I suppose if it's the same measure, it's less of a problem. I don't know if you'll have the same consistency in the time points at which the questionnaire was administered in a registry context as you would have in a trial context. So that can probably be a challenge. Yeah, I'm not sure. I really haven't had any experience with that. So
Okay.
happy to brainstorm it with you. But yeah.
Thank you. We've got a question from Claire Stewart from AROC. And I'll just read it out to you. And this is, I think, use of PROs outside of trials. Claire says, hospital and health services are increasingly implementing PROMs in clinical practice. With more limited research knowledge in the health community, especially around bias and clear implementation or administration of the tools, do you think there is a risk of incorrect interpretation of results? And how do we improve or ensure that the measures are used, analysed, and interpreted correctly? Great question, Claire. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. Again, I think if you know ahead of time, you know, which sites or centres you might be using that data from, you could proactively go and train those sites about how the questionnaire is administered. I think one of the biggest problems that we see in an environment where the research nurse or the person administering questionnaires is not trained is that somebody else completes the questionnaire on the patient's behalf. It happens a lot. You know, think about an elderly patient where their child might be completing the questionnaire for them, for example. So those are some of the issues that you might encounter. Yes, there's definitely potential for bias, but sometimes some data is better than no data. If you're using it in a trial context, I think you just have to be very transparent about the potential limitations there with, you know, lack of standardization of the administration. Yeah, but if you know ahead of time, I guess you could just treat it as any trial context and just provide the training and guidance up front and refer people perhaps to Proteus and other places where they can learn a bit more about the theory behind PRO research and some of the methodological concerns.
Okay, I think that's terrific. I mean, the resources that you've provided and been involved in developing, you know, definitely parts are very applicable to outside of trials as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next question I wanted to ask was about MIDS, minimal important differences, particularly for those utility-based instruments. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in developing a minimal important difference for a quality of life questionnaire, and in particular, if you've done that for something like the EQ5D or the SF36, which has a transformation to a utility instrument, being the SF60, or any other generic quality of life instruments? And again, any thoughts or tips around interpretation of the MIDS, use of the MIDS, or research to develop MIDS where they may not exist yet?
I haven't had experience in developing MIDS for a utility measure, but for regular, you know, quality of life profile measures, I've had a bit of experience. It's one of those things where there are a lot of different methods that can be used. I personally favour the methods that involve patients reflecting on the change that they consider to be meaningful. I think it sort of brings into focus that PROs should reflect, you know, the patient's experience. And so if a difference of say 3 points in a questionnaire doesn't meaningfully feel different to a patient, then that shouldn't be considered as a meaningful change if it does sort of reflect a statistical difference. So yeah, there are a lot of different methods that can be used, but one good method as part of a sort of number of different, you'd want to be using more than one method to develop a mid, first and foremost, but one of those methods should also be asking the patients about what, you know, was a meaningful change for them. You know, what number on a scale as compared to what number they're on at the moment would they consider to be a meaningful improvement, and what would be like a meaningful decrement in that domain. In terms of where to look for good methodologies, I think the EORTC does this really well. They've published a number of different MIDs for their various quality of life measures. Again, that's in a cancer context. There are some good papers out there as well. Madeline King wrote a paper, I think, going back 10 years now. Dennis Ravicki also wrote a paper. Yeah, so it's a huge area. I don't think I could do the methodology any justice in this presentation, but yeah, there is guidance out there. Happy to help you, direct you to some of that if you like.
Terrific. Okay, no, that's great. Thank you. Well, I think we've come to time. And so I would like, on behalf of the ACTA Health Economists Alongside Trial Special Interest Group, thank you very much, Rebecca, for sharing your expertise with us today, and for, you know, answering our questions. People can find you and ask you directly. I'm sure they can find your email, and also go to the reference documentation that you've provided. I'd like to close this webinar now and thank ACTA very much. I know we have the next seminar coming up in 2 months. Vivian, can you announce whether that speaker has been confirmed?
Yes, the speaker is confirmed, and the date is the 26th of June.
Okay, and we've already got requests for Rebecca's email, and the speaker and topic. Sorry, Vivian, I don't have it at hand.
Yes, I'm just jumping into my notes as well. We have an overseas speaker locked in. The topic is pre-trial VOI analyses to guide trial prioritization and data collection. And the speaker is Edward Wilson from the UK.
Fantastic. Yep, it's terrific. So, yeah, please tune into that if you're interested in value of information analysis. I think it'll be, again, another great methodological presentation. Thanks very much again, Rebecca, and everyone have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.